So today's a fun day. I've got all the priming and prep and all that stuff done. So now I get to move on to the real fun stuff, which is actually putting all this stuff together and squeezing some rivets. That's the part I probably enjoy the most, just because you're bringing something to completion. It's time to put this thing together. Let's build a horizontal stabilizer. I'm happy to say also the priming came out pretty good. I think I've finally got the mix about where I want it as far as the thickness and the color and everything on this. I think on the last batch, I actually got the ratio a little bit wrong. According to the manufacturer, 1.5 parts of the activator to 1 part of the actual primer. What a lot of people do is they're mixing it at a 2-to-1 ratio. They say it goes on a little bit better, atomizes nicer, and it's just a little bit easier to get the right coating on it. So my initial approach on it though was to go with a 1.5-to-1 ratio, just because I like to follow the directions and see how that went. The problem is, when I mixed it for the first parts on the vertical stabilizer, I think I had it 1.5-to-1, and overall I thought it came out pretty good. Still seemed a little bit thicker than I think what it's supposed to be, but it wasn't too bad. But the last time that I did it with the rudder stuff, that one seemed to come out really thick. It actually came out kind of splotchy, and looking back on it, I think what I actually ended up doing was mixing it on a 1-to-1 ratio. Instead of doing it in 2 separate cups, I did it in 1 cup and then went to add what I thought in my head was doubling it up, and I think I actually only ended up at a 1-to-1 ratio, and I think that's why it came out so thick and kind of splotchy, because this time I did it at a 2-to-1 ratio and it came out beautiful. It atomized nicely when it went on, pretty much went on just like water would out of the spray gun. So I thought it was a problem with the spray gun last time, seemed like the pressure was a little bit off. But this time it atomized nice at a really low pressure, probably less than 20 PSI. The instructions on that primer call for a PSI of about 12. I didn't want to go quite that low, but I definitely kept it under 20, so it was a little bit closer. The end result was exactly what you want when you spray it on. Almost a little bit transparent, but it just causes a slight color change to the bare aluminum. And it's nice and smooth and even coverage, so I think I finally figured it out. The only issue that I had was when you're wearing the paint suit, it doesn't want to let any of that paint and the chemicals in, so it doesn't breathe. It's not like cotton or anything like that. It's sealed up airtight. So when you're wearing it, you're sweating like crazy on the inside of the suit. Problem was where that came down to my wrist, it's got some elastic on that, and then of course I'm wearing gloves. But there was a lot of water that pooled up at the bottom of my wrist, and there were a couple times when I was spraying that the water dripped out and it came down here and hit, and then I went to touch that up, and of course it took off the primer that I had on there. So after I was all done and it had dried, I just kind of sponged a little bit of extra primer on there. It doesn't look great, but the coverage is there. It's all that matters. I think next time what I'll make sure and do is pull the gloves on to the outside of the suit. That way all that water that's getting pushed out of my body into the suit will be trapped in the suit till I take it off. It's not fun, I'll say that. So the first step is to just go back in the plans, pretty much all the way back to the first page where I left off, where I was supposed to rivet the rear spar doubler to the back of the rear spar, and then also rivet all the hinge brackets onto the rear spar as well. That was the last 2 steps on that page, and like I said, I held off on that so I could get everything primed all together. So I'll just briefly go back through all the steps above that to make sure I don't miss anything as I Cleco everything back into position. Make sure I just don't miss a step on anything that I've done there. Make sure I've got everything oriented right, and then I'll rivet it all together. So I've got 6 holes on each side that do not get any rivets at this time, and I think that's because they'll probably get some rivets when you join up the ribs in there later on. So I marked it on the spar doubler itself, and now I'm also putting tape on the rivets, and I'm just going to leave these 6 rivets in place while I rivet everything else together. And the blue tape just reminds me not to take them back out until everything else is done. Sadly, as you're going to see in a little bit, I really should have been paying more attention to where I was putting that blue tape. So the instructions don't really specify whether you should put the domed manufactured head on one side or the other. It does, however, say that when you put the brackets on, which are going to go in here, that you want the domed head on the bracket side, so it looks like that. So because of that, and I don't think it otherwise matters, I'm just going to do them all on the same side, just for consistency. So once I triple check that I've got the orientation correct and any holes that should not be riveted taped off, I rivet the doubler to the rear spar. Sadly, sometimes triple checking is still not enough if you move too fast. So I just screwed that up. So these, I put tape on it to make sure that I didn't put a rivet in it. Well, these don't have any tape on it. Problem is, I marked it here so I wouldn't put anything on there, and I put tape on the wrong cleco. So guess who gets to drill out a rivet? Yeah. Crap. All right, well, I'm gonna get the rest of these riveted together, and then I'll come back and drill that guy out and make it right. So mistakes are gonna happen. The key is to constantly evaluate your work as you move on, and hopefully you catch them early. All right, so those are all done as far as riveting the doubler onto the back of the rear spar. These two guys here in the middle, those get flush head rivets, so I'll do those in a minute. Then I'll drill this guy out who's not supposed to be there. All right, well that came off too easy. Now, switch up to smaller drill bit size. Put just a little bit down in there to weaken it. So, being real careful to stay away from the edge of the hole itself with the drill bit because it's smaller than the hole. Just taking a little material out of the inside of that rivet to kind of weaken it. And now, if I can get a hold of it, give it a turn, it should come right out. Just like that. Hole looks very good. Didn't touch it anywhere at all. And we're good to go. All right, crisis averted. With the doubler now attached and the mistake drilled out, I move on to attaching and riveting the hinge brackets. There they are. Now I just got to do 3 more of those sets and we're done. All right, so the rear spar assembly is now complete. Got the doubler riveted on, and we've got all of the hinges on there as well. So I'll pick it up from here tomorrow. The last step with the rear spar for now is to go ahead and bolt center hinge bracket onto the center. That's why we put the flush head rivets right here in the middle, because that's exactly where the center hinge bracket is going to go. And it's got some bolts that have to go on there and get torqued down properly, so We'll do that tomorrow. See you then. With the rear spar assembly complete, I'll set that aside and move on in the instructions to the remaining steps for the front spar assembly. Again, taking my time, I make sure to get the orientation correct and all parts clecoed back to the correct locations using my markings as a cross-check. There are 5 different rivet types that will be used for this assembly, so I take a lot of time to identify which ones go where. Since I'll be using a pneumatic squeezer to set the rivets, I start with a rivet type that will be used the most and work my way down from there. This way I can reduce the number of times I'll need to adjust the piston on the squeezer for the corresponding length of the rivet. Alright, so that completes the assembly and riveting together of the front spar. All these clecos go out. Those are just holding in the spar caps, which are actually now riveted to the top. So those clecos will come out because the rest of those holes will get filled in when we put the skin on top of that. So the front spar is done for now. Next up is moving on to start attaching ribs to everything. And then once that's done, we'll move on to putting the skin and the whole assembly into the cradles and start really forming it up like a horizontal stabilizer. Cool, moving on. With both spar assemblies complete, I move on to completing the stringer web assembly. In this process, I rivet the 2 center in-spar ribs to the stringer web. These are the ribs which I modified earlier by bending the flanges to 12.5 degrees, where they will eventually connect to the spars. Next, the stringers are also riveted to the web. Once again, I take my time to make sure that I'm attaching the stringers in the correct orientation as I marked them earlier. Alright, so the stringer web assembly is all complete. That was a lot of work. I had to drill out a couple of rivets. The ones up here in the corner, those had to be bucked because you couldn't get the squeezer in there, and one of them I put a smiley face on, so I had to go ahead and drill that out and redo it, but she's done now. So that's got front spar, the rear spar, the stringer assembly put together. Next up we'll attach the rest of the in-spar ribs to this guy and then move on with all the other ribs and the cradles and the skin. But that's going to happen tomorrow because I've had enough for one day, so I'll be back. Now it's on to completing the largest substructure I've created so far in the build, the front spar rib assembly. I begin by riveting the 2 outboard nose ribs to the spar. After clecoing the stringer web assembly to the back of the spar, I position the remaining in-spar ribs by sliding them along the stringers, lining them up with their corresponding holes, and cleco them in place. Finally, I cleco the other 6 ribs to the spar and begin riveting the entire assembly together. There's a note in the instructions, however, not to rivet the center 2 in-spar ribs at this time. That's because the holes where they attach to the spar are the same holes where the 2 center nose ribs with the 10-degree bends will also attach. So those will all get riveted together at the same time later on. This completes the assembly of the internal skeletal structure for the horizontal stabilizer. So next I set up the cradles and drop in the skins. From here, the riveting must be done in a very exact sequence, otherwise you end up painting yourself into a corner. If the 4 interior ribs were already attached to the front spar, there'd be no way to reach down through the spar to rivet them to the skins in the next step. So The next step is to rivet those ribs to the skins by themselves. As you can see in the diagram, they will be attached to the front spar with blind rivets once that whole assembly gets inserted on top of them. Alright, so nose ribs have been riveted down inside of the skins. And the next step is to take this whole assembly, put it down inside there. And then those nose ribs that we've attached here, those are gonna get attached to the front of the spar here. And basically what I'm gonna do is cleco everything all together at this point. And then the step following that, once it's all clecoed together, obviously, is to start riveting all that together and close things up. And then the last step will be to put the rear spar on the back of that. So, it's really hot, in case you can't tell. It was a lot of work getting these nose ribs put in here. It's a pretty tight space to work in down there, and it's hot, so I'm getting a little bit tired. So I'm gonna go ahead and cleco this guy in place, and then I think I'm calling it quits for the day there. And then I'll pick up from there tomorrow and see where we get. So with the internal nose ribs riveted in place, I lower the front spar assembly into the skins. I adjust spacing on the cradles where necessary to make sure all of the holes line up between the ribs and the skins. I begin at one end and slowly cleco all of the skeleton to the skins. I'm being very methodical and taking my time to make sure that all of the clecos go through both the holes in the skins as well as the ribs and other substructure. For the most part, it all lines up easily, but it's important to make sure none of the ribs or anything are out of alignment. This is especially important near the center of the structure, where the cleco may be going through multiple components, like the skin, the spar, spar cap, and a rib all at once. Vans recommends having at least 350 of these 3/32 inch clecos for the project. And despite only having clecos in every other hole on most of this structure, it took almost all of them to hold it together. So I would agree with that number. So this seemed like a great place to end the day and pick it back up with a fresh set of eyes. Picking up where I left off, the next step was to secure the 4 nose ribs, which I just riveted to the skins, to the front spar using blind rivets. I'll share with you that the spacing between the ribs on the back side of the spar make getting the rivet puller in position a little challenging. I'm using a very basic $5 Harbor Freight manual rivet puller here, which in general works fine for the limited amount of pull rivets which are part of the build. I don't think a pneumatic rivet puller would even fit down in here, nor do I think you'd have much space for a longer, more robust puller. I think what I have is about as small as they come, and even with that, I still had to put it in at a slight angle just to fit in between the ribs. So with that out of the way, I spend the next few hours riveting the flange that runs the entire length of the front spar to the skins. As you can see, there are a lot of rivets for this step and limited space for my arm, especially near the middle, where I have to get my hand below the stringers. Also, in order to reach down to the spar flange over the end of the skin, I have to stand on a stepladder and then kind of hunch over to position a rivet gun on the outside. So needless to say, I was a little bit tired by the time I finished up both sides of the spar. The only way I can think of that would make this easier would be to have a table that is adjustable, so you could bring the height down a little bit. So with that step done, I called it a day. I had planned to finish up the rest of the riveting the next day. However, unexpectedly, I had to make an early morning trip in the Arrow down to Plant City, Florida, where Jimmy's World was unveiling the Elvis Jet. If you don't follow that channel or you're not familiar, watch this video. I'll also link it below. In addition to the Elvis Jet itself, I also provide background on his channel and how the whole project evolved. Anyway, once I got home from that, I did still have a couple hours to get most of the ribs riveted to the skins, which was the next step. So to this point, I've riveted the skin across the flange of the front spar. The next step is to rivet to all the ribs. Here in the center with the in-spar ribs, we first take it up just as high as the in-spar rib assembly to this point. Then we close off the attachment to the skin there with the spars themselves, and then continue up the ribs. And then the final step will be to put the rear spar on here and then close that up. I think at this point, I've finally found the optimal pressure setting in the rivet gun, which is allowing me to buck each rivet with a single, kind of well-timed blast from the gun. This definitely helps speed up the process and get things moving along a little faster. All right, so that one's done. 3 more sides like that, and then we close up the ends, put the top on, and then we're all done. The ends of the stabilizer close up nicely here using the thin nose yoke, which is definitely needed to get the last couple of rivets in the tip of the nose ribs. The other option would be to use the rivet gun and then just buck it with a bucking bar. All right, so there it is. Horizontal stabilizer is complete. Well, sort of. So you may notice I have not riveted the rear spar onto the whole assembly yet. And that's because before I close this up, I still need to bolt this guy onto the back of this. And to do that, I need a torque wrench. Now, I have a torque wrench, but this torque wrench is in pound-feet. What I need is one that is in inch-pounds. And I could do the math to convert this. However, the low-end range on this as far as the torque is just too high for what I need for this little guy. What I need for this little guy is about 28 pound-inches of torque, plus the drag for the nut, so I'm looking at about 42 pound-inches. The low end on that I think is around 60 or even higher than that. So I've got one on order, it's on its way. But it's not going to be here for a few more days, and more importantly, I am leaving to go to Oshkosh in the next day or so. So I don't want to wait another week or more for this video to come out. All that's left to do is torque this guy down and then rivet along the top of this, and it's done. I think we've seen how that goes. I don't think you're going to miss out on too much of that. So the next video up after this is going to be the elevator, which is going to go on the back here so I can control the pitch of the aircraft. But before I do that, somebody brought to my attention in the comments, thankfully, a pretty big mistake that I made with the vertical stabilizer, which was the first thing that I built, and it's actually the first component that I put together for the vertical stabilizer. So, before I move on to the elevator in the next video, I'm going to go ahead and go through the mistake that I made, go over the fix that I came up with in consultation with the Vans, and then I'll walk you through the actual fix on that. So that's it, guys. Horizontal stabilizer is complete. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you on the next video.